Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Lots of big stories that I'm very excited to talk about, namely Amazon. First warehouse voting to join a union, historic moment. I have about a million things I want to say about this, so we'll dig into everything we've learned about how exactly they were able to pull this off, and a little bit of the media reaction, which is always an interesting part of the story.
That one in there.
Also, some terrible breaking news in Ukraine about the situation there on the ground. We'll get into that. We'll also talk about the economic situation as best we can tell in Russia. New signs that, sadly, as we predicted, the sanctions that we have levied, the economic warfare that we are conducting against Russia is completely backfiring. I mean, that's just pretty much.
It may not be working as well as people thought.
It may not be working as well as people thought, and it seems to be having the effect of bolstering Russian public opinion in favor of Putin and in favor of this war. So exactly the opposite of the outcome that you would actually want, but we'll dig into those details. Also, a new study that's kind of good and bad. It reveals that cable news, sadly, really does impact the way that people think about the world and think about politics.
No question.
The good side of that is that it also indicates that people's minds can be changed. So that's hopeful, because if you change their information diet, you can create a better political landscape. So we'll talk about that. Also, it looks like Jen Psaki has a new job coming up here. Lo and behold, she's going to MSNBC, Saagar.
Yes.
And it is pretty extraordinary for someone who is still the White House press secretary to be conducting these type of negotiations. It's so extraordinary, actually, that even the White House press corps was repeatedly pressing on her on it, including one of the people at NBC, Kristen Welker, who would be her colleague if these reports are indeed true. We have on here Christian Smalls might be joining us. Not 100% sure about that. So we had a tentative confirmation. He's
a busy guy.
Been
we forget him.
Extraordinarily busy. So we'll see if we'll get him. If not, we've got another piece of the Amazon story that we want to tell you about, another media reaction from one of his appearances on MSNBC. But let us start with the news out of Staten Island and Amazon. As you all probably already know, a warehouse on Staten Island, it's called JFK 8, has now officially become the very first Amazon warehouse to vote to unionize. It was not particularly close. This was extraordinary and historic in all kinds of ways, not only because it's the first, but also because Amazon is such a behemoth, because they really set the conditions for labor across the country, because they've spent millions of dollars to keep this from happening anywhere, and also because these workers decided to go a completely different path. They didn't join up with an existing union. Christian Smalls and his colleagues, and Derek Palmer, his best friend, who's the vice president there, who still works at Amazon, they decided that they were going to start a brand new worker-led union called the Amazon Labor Union, and that they were going to start from scratch and organize this warehouse. And lo and behold, that effort and that strategy has succeeded where no one else has been able to. Let's take a listen to a little bit of the man himself upon his victory.
Dan, 2 years ago, my life changed forever. I only wanted to do the right thing and speak up for the workers behind me. Jason was one of them, Derek, Jordan, Gerald, everybody in JFK. You know, when COVID-19 came to play, Amazon failed us. They dropped the ball. They lied to the public saying they're doing all these things. None of that was the reality of our situation. So I let her walk out after they quarantined just me and nobody else. And that walkout led to my firing. Then a week after that, a couple weeks after that, maybe a week or two, that memo that came out calling me not smart or articulate. Ironically, they also said to make me the face of the whole unionizing efforts, which I had no intention at the time.
Now, you guys probably all know the story that he's referring to there, but we've been interviewing Christian since he was fired from Amazon.
On and off for 2 years.
For almost exactly 2 years ago was our first interview with him. And he said in that interview, I may have started a revolution, which is kind of incredible. Clearly, that was exactly what was going on. But so he was very distressed over the lack of COVID safety procedures. He was witnessing his colleagues getting sick. They weren't getting any information. They didn't have adequate PPE within the warehouse. And so he led what was actually very small walkout at the time. I think we may have even covered it here. Amazon retaliates against him, fires him, and then as if that wasn't bad enough, one of their top executives, in a memo that went out to all of the leadership, up to and including Jeff Bezos, says, hey, you know what we should do? We should make this guy, Christian Smalls, the face of the Amazon union movement because he's, quote, not smart or articulate. That lights the fire under Christian, and ultimately, we see what the results are today. We're learning more and more about exactly how they pulled off this extraordinary victory. There have been a number of good pieces that have looked at the tactics they've used, the people that were involved, why this effort succeeded when others failed, and also some of the backlash to Amazon's aggressive, over-the-top tactics, which really did backfire. Let's go ahead and put this Jacobin piece up on the screen. This is an interview with one of the worker organizers, a woman named Angelica Maldonado. And a few things that jumped out at me here, and this, by the way, is from our friend Eric Blanc, who we've interviewed as well, who's a great labor reporter. So a couple things that jumped out at me here is she talked a lot about how they went about bridging generational divides, racial divides, ethnic divides, language divides. You have a very diverse workforce that they had to be able to communicate with and be able to win over people's trust. She talks about the fact that the younger workers were easier to sway than the older workers. And, you know, that makes a lot of sense in terms of if you look at our political landscape, younger voters tend to be more in favor of unions, more on the left politically. Older voters tend to be, you know, more sort of on the right and have more traditional economic views. So that made sense. But she also talked about how they organized across racial lines. She said that was another thing, reaching out to the diverse races at JFK 8. For instance, a lot of our coworkers are African. During the campaign, I had an idea which ended up turning out great. My neighbor, she's also African and she caters. So I said, we've given out so much food. Why don't we give out food that targets the culture of the workers at Amazon? So one day I asked my neighbor to make us some African fried rice, and that really attracted a whole bunch of African workers towards us, and we gained a couple of new organizers off that. I would say having organizers of the same race was also crucial. I'm Hispanic, half Hispanic myself, but I don't speak Spanish, so it was easier for one of our organizers who speaks Spanish to speak to those Hispanic workers who had questions. Another thing she talks about, and this really jumped down at me, is, you know, part of what Amazon has used successfully in the past, Saagar, is this climate of fear.
Yes.
Where people feel like, oh, I can't stand up to these people. I can't possibly join a union. I'm going to get fired. My life is going to be ruined. And so they took what they described as intentional calculated risks to demonstrate that they could stand up for themselves, that they shouldn't be afraid of Amazon. What she says is they would go into these union-busting captive audience meetings knowing they were going to get kicked out because they weren't invited. And she said, though we did get kicked out eventually, action like that showed them that there are certain rights and certain laws that protect us and that we should not be scared of Amazon. And of course, Saagar, Christian Smalls is a perfect example of that because they did the absolute worst they possibly could to that guy. And here he is, still unafraid, still fighting, and still pushing forward.
Yeah, it was an ultimate smear campaign that backfired, obviously, tremendously. And I think that that's what we saw at the heart of this at the beginning. When they said he's not smart, he's not very articulate, it ended up resulting in the resignation of a top Amazon executive at the time. And ultimately, you know, they awoke a sleeping giant.
Yes,
Even
they did.
It's funny because watching the New York Times and the traditional media kind of catch up to a story, which we've been doing for so long, kind of is interesting to see how exactly they interpret the lens. Let's put this up there on the screen. The New York Times profiled Christian, and they talk about there how two best friends beat Amazon, specifically talking about the original firing, about how Christian decided in order to start a union from scratch rather than start with another established union, and how really, I mean, what he's accomplished is one of the most extraordinary feats in the history of the modern labor movement. I don't
really is.
think there is another way to describe it. We watched what happened in Bessemer, Alabama. We watched also the Teamsters unions. Many others told Christian he was making a huge mistake. I remember, I think we interviewed him here, 6 months ago, exactly on this. And he's like, well, a lot of people didn't want us to do this, but we decided to start it from scratch because we wanted it to be our own. And of course, everybody said that wasn't going to work, lack of institutional connection. And what they point to on the most significant part is his low budget and then just focusing relentlessly on traditional and important organizing tactics, like you point to in the Jacobin piece, culminates then in the actual victory that we see for himself. And I think that that's what's fascinating, is that now with the media attention on him, they are now unable, Amazon is, in order to paint him as, not smart or articulate, and they are going to throw everything at the wall in order to make sure that this union never sticks, that they have no bargaining power, and I'm really curious to see how they begin targeting Christian himself.
Yes.
Because that is going to happen.
But the fact of the matter is, the way they've targeted him this far, it only played into his hands.
Right.
Because this is a man who worked at this warehouse, who had relationships there. And so when they fired him, when they smeared him as not smart or articulate, when they had him arrested for bringing food into the warehouse to serve these workers, and by the way, they had gotten an order from the NLRB, and this was really critical, saying that organizers could talk about unions and organize on within the Amazon warehouses. That mattered a lot. There's a few other things from this New York Times piece that are really interesting, which lays out not just the smart strategy of Christian and Derek Palmer and the other worker organizers, but also some of the big missteps that Amazon made. Because as Jody Cantor put it, the reporter on that story, while Amazon deployed an incident commander, the workers deployed baked ziti. So they were there, they were organizing at a bus stop that all the workers came to, that, funneling into and out of work. They were serving food, they were hyper local, hyper culturally competent with all the different diverse constituencies in this warehouse. And so when Amazon would say, oh, he's not smart or articulate, or get people arrested, this just made them look extremely heavy-handed and ultimately really backfired. Think about the odds here. Christian said that they spent about $120,000 overall in this effort. Let me tell you, that is peanuts compared to what normally goes into these things. He says, we started this with nothing, with 2 tables, 2 chairs, and a tent. Amazon spent more than $4.3 million just on anti-union consultants nationwide just last year. And that's just scratching the surface of how much they spent to try to destroy this. There was one other incident they say here that was a big Amazon mistake. Reportedly, one of their anti-union consultants called the labor organizers, who are mostly black, thugs. And that also backfired and, and this has been reported to the NLRB too, made the workers feel like they were discriminatory against these organizers. All of this led to a situation where they quote a worker there, a woman named Kathleen LeJews, who's 41, who said she's not a big union fan, but she voted for the union to send a message to the company because she said, quote, the humanity at Amazon is gone. I think that says it all there, that they were able to win over even people who were skeptical because they were so relentlessly hyper-local and culturally competent and, friendly, warm faces, extremely hopeful, while Amazon is coming over the top with a gigantic hammer. There's one other thing I want to mention from this New York Times article, which is they mentioned in passing, Saagar, that there were some labor sympathizers who went to work at the warehouse just to try to help with this effort. And they quote one woman in particular, Ms. Medina, and it turns out she was the president of the Queens DSA chapter. So I want to know more about that, about how many DSA members went and took jobs at this warehouse and other places to try to be helpful in the organizing effort. Because even though the numbers, I'm sure, are relatively small, just having a few more people who can do the communication and organize on breaks and all of that, that really makes a difference.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I do want to know more about that too, because now is the real question. Well, we have upcoming. How many votes do we have upcoming in Amazon in terms of the New York area?
We have one more warehouse that is scheduled to vote. I think that voting starts April 23rd. Yes, so that is coming right now.
So what the point here is how much of this was a one-off and how much of it can be scaled. And that's actually, that's the ultimate question whenever it comes to all of these things, which is that at this point it was a victory. Can it then be transported, kind of a unionization effort in a box, and then exported to different warehouses and sweep the country? Now, we saw that happen with Starbucks, and we know that it's happening quite well. Starbucks, though, has a very, very different workforce. We've talked about here a lot. Starbucks is a much more educated workforce. These are people who are disproportionately younger, probably also also disproportionately a lot more liberal. And I don't mean that in terms of a disparaging way, just much more likely to probably have been actively involved in like a Bernie Sanders type campaign, where an Amazon worker is really going to run the gamut in terms of both political beliefs, socioeconomic, and possibly just politically disconnected, most likely to fall into a non-voter category. So
That's
how do you
Christian
get...
talks about,
Yeah.
because when you're working at Amazon, they just take over your whole damn life.
Of course. I mean,
Yeah.
what are you supposed to do? We talk about this all the time. The people feel shame whenever they're like, I don't, they kind of say it under their breath, like, I know I'm supposed to care, but I don't care about politics. It's like, listen, you're trying to pay your bills. You're working paycheck to paycheck. Gas is $4.50 a gallon. Your rent is out of control, heating bills, and you're worried about your kids, medical expense, or they got pulled out of school. Who can blame you? You have way bigger problems. So unionizing that workforce and in a scalable way is going to be the single biggest obstacle. And also, I mean, this is probably a good segue to the next part of this, but it's not like Amazon is going to just let this happen. They are throwing everything they can at this.
Absolutely. We have no idea what they're about to throw at us. Let's put this last piece for part one up on the screen, A4. This is a great profile actually before the vote. I want to give credit to the city for interviewing Christian Smalls and Derek Palmer before the vote happened here. And this piece gets into a lot of the generational approach here. Derek and Chris are both 33 years old, so they are young. I think that makes them young millennials, not Gen Z, right? And then, yeah, for sure. And then they're also organizing a lot of Zoomers using TikTok and, just being sort of like of that generation and really comfortable. And so that was a big part of the appeal. So there was a lot going on here. I mean, I think if you add it all together, they had a really smart approach. They went down to Bessemer, and what they took away was that the organizers who had come in felt like outsiders. And they said, we're going to do this a different way. We're going to be hyper local. We're going to be hyper, engaged with the Amazon worker and really understand what their day-to-day is like. That clearly was a smart strategy. You had Amazon overreach, and frankly, I don't know if Amazon took them that seriously, because a lot of the country, the media, certainly political class, didn't take them seriously at all. So, you have a national landscape also that is wildly different than it was just a short time ago, where there are lots of jobs, but the question is, are they good jobs? And so workers feel a little bit more empowered to take this kind of risk. And then it's no accident that the Starbucks movement and the Amazon movement starts in New York. New York is the state that has the largest union density. So you have a culture of unionization. Christian's mom and Angelica, the other organizer I mentioned, both of their moms were members of SEIU 1199.
There you go.
So they have, union membership in their blood. They understand what it's all about intuitively. You have that culture around you. And then you have, helpful members from DSA. Also, that's part of the culture there in that area. All of that coming together in kind of a perfect storm and pulling off what we all thought may well have been impossible. So it's an extraordinary story. Obviously, I'm extremely excited about it. I think it's fascinating to dig into all these facets. And before we move on to the next part, the other thing I want to say is they do have another vote coming up this month. And so if you guys are able to contribute to their solidarity fund, they did this with peanuts, but they're going to need some resources to keep the train going.
Link is going to be down there in the description. Make sure you guys can help.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.